I was 63 years old when I received a letter that made my hands shake, not from nerves, from pure disbelief. It was a Tuesday morning, midwinter. One of those flat, gray Wellington days where the wind comes in off the harbor and cuts straight through you no matter how many layers you're wearing. I was in the kitchen, still in my dressing gown, making porridge and half listening to morning report on the radio. The kind of ordinary morning you don't expect anything from. The letter was in a brown envelope with a court stamp on it. Official. My name typed neatly across the front. I thought for a moment it was something to do with my rates, or maybe a jury summons. I opened it standing right there at the bench. Spoon still in my hand. It took me 3 reads to understand what I was looking at. My ex-wife was taking me to family court. She was claiming I owed child support backdated nearly 2 years for a child she said was mine. I stood there in my dressing gown in my Wellington kitchen and I started to laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so completely, utterly absurd that laughing was the only thing my brain knew how to do. My ex-wife, Rosalie, and I had been divorced for 3 years. We had no children together. We had tried. Early on, that's a whole other story. And not one I'll go into here, but we never had children. The marriage ended badly. Not violently, nothing like that. Just the slow, grinding kind of bad where 2 people spend years making each other miserable until one day, someone finally says out loud what both of you already know. In our case, that someone was her. She packed up and left for Christchurch, and I stayed in the house we'd bought together in Newtown until the settlement was finalized and I had to sell it. We'd had no contact in nearly 2 years. Not a text, not an email. Nothing. And now she was telling a court I was the father of her 1-year-old daughter. I put down the spoon. I turned off the radio. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the letter a 4th time. The child had been born 14 months after our divorce was finalized. Rosalie had named me as the father on some form, and now the IRD was involved, and there was a court date, and I was apparently supposed to show up and explain myself. The thing that struck me, the thing that made it feel unreal, was the confidence of it. The letter had this bureaucratic certainty to it, as if the matter were already half settled, as if I were simply being notified of something that was already understood to be true. I called my brother Noel that afternoon. He lives up in Tauranga. Retired now. Used to be a builder. Noel has a way of cutting through things. She's lost the plot, he said, when I'd finished explaining. I know. Tell me you're getting a lawyer. I'm getting a lawyer. I didn't sleep well that week. Not because I was frightened exactly. More because I kept turning the thing over and over, trying to understand the logic of it. Rosalie wasn't stupid. She wasn't reckless, not usually. So what was she thinking? What was the plan here? My lawyer was a woman named Patricia, based in the CBD, mid-50s. No nonsense in the way that good lawyers tend to be when they've seen everything. She read through the paperwork while I sat across from her, and she didn't say much. Just made small sounds under her breath. Then she put it down and looked at me over her glasses. The claim is that the child was conceived during the marriage, she said. They're arguing the separation period overlapped with a reconciliation. There was no reconciliation, I said. I know. That's what we'll establish. She folded her hands. We'll request a DNA test. That'll be the end of it. It seems straightforward. It seemed like something that should take a few weeks at most. It took 8 months. I won't bore you with all the procedural delays. There were adjournments. There were scheduling conflicts. There was a period of about 6 weeks where Rosalie's legal representation changed and everything stalled. Every time I thought we were about to cross the finish line, something pushed it further away. What I will tell you is that during those 8 months, I learned things. Not all at once. Slowly, in pieces, the way you learn things when you start pulling on a thread and find it connects to something you weren't expecting. The first piece came from my old neighbor in Newtown, a retired teacher named Harold, who still lived in the street and had known Rosalie and me as a couple. He rang me about 4 months after I received the court letter. He'd heard, through mutual acquaintances, what was happening. He was careful about how he said it. The way older men of his generation tend to be careful, not wanting to interfere, not wanting to speak out of turn. But he thought I should know. There was a man named Dominic. Harold had seen him at the house, our old house, before the sale during the last year of the marriage. Not once. Several times. Coming and going in a way that had struck Harold as odd, though he'd told himself it wasn't his business. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt, even though the marriage was over, even though by any rational measure I was well clear of it. There's something about learning that kind of thing that finds a soft place in you and sits there. I'd spent years in that marriage wondering what was wrong, why we couldn't connect, why nothing I did seemed to be enough, and apparently at least part of the answer had been there the whole time, in a man Harold had seen coming and going through the front gate. But that was my pain. And it wasn't the point. The point was, Dominic might be the father of this child, I told Patricia. She was unsurprised in that way she had, like very little surprised her anymore. She said it was worth noting, but that the DNA test would resolve everything regardless. Then came the second piece. About 6 months in, I got a phone call from a man I'll call Neil. I'm changing his name slightly because what he told me was personal, and I don't think it's my place to identify him. Neil had been in a relationship with Rosalie after the divorce. They'd been together for about a year. He'd ended things roughly 8 months before I got my court letter. He'd heard what was happening to me. He wanted to tell me that he had also received correspondence. Not a court summons, not yet, but a letter from a solicitor, claiming that he might be financially responsible for the child. So there were 2 of us. I remember sitting down very slowly in my office chair when Neil told me that. Something settled in my mind. Some last remaining doubt or confusion. Because up until that point, even with everything, some part of me had wondered if there was a version of events I wasn't seeing. Some explanation that made this less deliberate than it appeared. There wasn't. The court date finally arrived on a cold morning in August. I drove myself in. Patricia met me in the foyer. We took the lift to the 3rd floor and found the courtroom and sat outside on those hard plastic chairs that all court buildings seem to have, no matter what country you're in, and waited. Rosalie arrived with her lawyer about 10 minutes after us. I hadn't seen her in 3 years. She looked well. Good clothes, hair done, and she walked in carrying herself in a way that I remembered. That particular way she had when she was certain of something, head slightly tilted up, unhurried. She didn't look at me. Her lawyer was young, well-dressed, carrying a leather folder under his arm. They sat across the corridor. I watched Rosalie lean over and say something to him, and he nodded, and she sat back, and she looked entirely composed. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. If she felt anything about seeing me across that corridor, she didn't show that either. Patricia had told me what to expect. The hearing would begin with procedural matters. The DNA results, which I had completed months earlier, through an accredited testing service, results submitted to the court, would be entered into evidence. We would make our submissions. What Patricia had not told me because she hadn't known was that Neil would be there. He had engaged his own lawyer and applied to be included in the proceedings, on the basis that he had been named in parallel correspondence. The court had allowed it. He was sitting in the gallery when I came in. I hadn't met Neil in person before. We'd spoken twice on the phone. He was younger than me, late 30s. I'd guess with the look of someone who worked outdoors. He gave me a small nod when our eyes met. Rosalie saw him. I watched her see him. For just a moment, one beat that composed expression flickered. Just a small thing. A tightening around the eyes. Then it was gone and she was composed again. The magistrate was a man in his 50s, efficient, not unkind. He moved through the preliminary matters briskly. Then he called for the DNA results. Patricia stood and submitted our documentation. The accredited DNA test, conducted through a laboratory with court-certified processes, showing with 99.98% certainty that I was not the biological father of Rosalie's daughter. Rosalie's lawyer didn't object. He couldn't, of course. You can't object to a DNA result. But here is what surprised me. Rosalie looked at the magistrate when the results were read out, and she was still smiling. Not widely, just that small, settled expression of someone who has accounted for this and has something else to play. I watched it, and I felt a cold sort of curiosity. Her lawyer stood up. He acknowledged the DNA results. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that in light of those results, his client wished to withdraw the claim against my client. However, he noted that the IRD matter remained open and that the question of paternity was still to be resolved for the purposes of the child's welfare. What happened next? I had not seen coming. Neil's lawyer stood up. She submitted a second DNA test. Neil had also done a DNA test 6 weeks after mine, conducted through the same accredited laboratory. The results were in the same format: official, certified, the full report attached. Neil was not the father either. The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at Rosalie. That expression, that particular composed expression, finally cracked. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in films. Just a slow, visible collapse. Like something underneath a surface giving way. She turned to her lawyer and said something quickly and quietly. And her lawyer put a hand up, the gesture that means, stop talking. Don't say anything. And she stopped. The magistrate looked at the documentation for a long time. Then, he looked up. He asked Rosalie's lawyer whether his client had any further submissions. There was a pause. Her lawyer said no. The magistrate said that in light of the evidence presented, the claim against me was formally dismissed. He noted that the submissions raised significant questions about the conduct of the proceedings and said he would be referring the matter for further review. He wasn't harsh about it. Magistrates rarely are, in my experience. But the words were clear enough. It was over. I sat in the car park afterward and rang my brother. Done, I said. Properly done? Dismissed. Referred for review. Noel was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? I thought about it. Tired, I said. And hungry. I forgot to have breakfast. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes out of relief more than anything else. Come up next weekend, he said. I'll put something on the barbecue. There are things I've thought about since. In the months that have passed, I've thought about Dominic, the man Harold saw at our house during the marriage. I don't know if he is the child's father. I don't know what happened there, or what the ongoing situation is. That child exists in the world, and deserves stability, and a parent who is honest about her circumstances. I hope she gets that. None of what happened was her fault. I've thought about how close I came to simply accepting the situation. There are men who do that, who receive documents like the one I received, and who, out of confusion or exhaustion or a misplaced sense of obligation, don't fight back, who pay and keep paying. For years. For a child that was never theirs. The law in New Zealand does provide protections, but they only work if you use them. If you know about them. If you have the means to access them. That's the thing about systems, they're only as useful as your ability to navigate them. I've thought about what it cost me to fight this. The legal fees weren't catastrophic, but they weren't nothing. 8 months of stress. 8 months of this thing sitting at the back of every day. I was retired, which meant I had time and flexibility that a younger man with a job and children of his own might not have had. I've wondered, more than once, what would have happened if I hadn't had that. I've thought about Neil, who went through something similar, and who handled it with more grace than I might have in his position. We've spoken a couple of times since. He's doing all right, and I've thought about what I'd say if I could sit down with any man who found himself holding a letter like the one I received on that gray Wellington morning. Get a lawyer. immediately. Not next week, immediately. Request a DNA test. Don't negotiate around it. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. Don't accept delays without a reason. In New Zealand, you have the right to establish biological parentage, and that right exists for good reason. Know that the law has a concept called paternity fraud. It is not widely prosecuted, but it is a real thing. And courts do not look favorably on deliberate misrepresentation. Know that if you are named as a father and you do not dispute it within the legal time frame, that designation can become binding regardless of biology. The time frames vary depending on your circumstances, but they are not indefinite. This is the thing that most people don't know, that inaction has legal consequences. And know that you are not alone. What happened to me and to Neil is not as unusual as you might think. It happens quietly, to men who don't talk about it because they're embarrassed or because they can't quite believe it happened. Talk to someone. Get advice. The porridge I left on the stove that morning was stone cold by the time I got back to it. I threw it out and made toast instead. And I sat in the winter light coming through the kitchen window, and I thought about how strange it is that a life can turn on a Tuesday morning. How ordinary everything looks when something extraordinary is about to land in it. My granddaughter rang that afternoon, my daughter's girl, 12 years old and already twice as clever as I ever was. She wanted to tell me about a project she was doing at school about native birds. She talked for 20 minutes about kiwi and huya and the problems with stoat predators, and I listened to every word. By the time she'd finished, the gray had lifted a little, and there was some actual light coming through. That's how it usually goes, I find. You get through the hard thing, and then the ordinary world comes back, and you let it. I've had a lot of time to think about what really happened in that courtroom and in the years that led to it. What Rosalie did wasn't a moment of panic or poor judgment. It was a calculation. She looked at two men, Neil and me, and she made a decision about who might be easiest to pressure, who might be too embarrassed to fight, who might simply pay rather than go through the ugliness of a court battle. That's not confusion. That's strategy. And when I think about it that way, it stops feeling personal and starts feeling like something colder, something that required a clear head and a deliberate choice. The thing about that kind of strategy is that it tends to carry its own undoing inside it. Not because of any invisible force evening the score, I don't believe in that, but because deception built on multiple fronts is structurally weak. Rosalie didn't account for Neil having his own lawyer. She didn't account for us comparing notes. She didn't account for the fact that 2 DNA tests would land in the same courtroom on the same morning and make the whole picture impossible to explain away. She'd planned for one man to fold. She hadn't planned for 2 men to stand. That's the tricky thing about dishonesty at scale. It requires everyone else to behave the way you've predicted. The moment one person steps outside the script, the whole thing becomes fragile. I think about the intelligence, the clear-headedness it took to get through those 8 months. Not brilliance, just the discipline to not catastrophize, to follow the process, to trust Patricia, to answer Neil's phone call honestly instead of defensively. There were moments when I wanted to ring Rosalie and demand an explanation. Patricia told me not to. She was right. Clarity and patience aren't exciting virtues, but they're the ones that actually got me out the other side intact. The energy, the steadiness mattered too. This wasn't a crisis that resolved in a week. It sat in the background of every ordinary day for 8 months. I still had to get up, still had to see my granddaughter on the weekends, still had to be present and functional and not let this thing consume me. There were nights when it felt close to consuming me, but each morning you get up again and you make the porridge or the toast, as it turned out, and you keep moving. And the Dawduk, the moral part. I've thought about what it would have meant to simply give up and pay. It would have been easier in the short term. It would also have been a lie I participated in. A child growing up without knowing her real father. A man somewhere, maybe Dominic, Maybe someone else never having to account for anything. These aren't abstract concerns. They're real consequences for a real child who deserved better from all the adults around her. I'm 63 years old. I'm not interested in being anyone's cautionary tale. But if there's something useful in what happened to me, it's this. Systems protect the people who use them. The law in this country isn't perfect, but it has mechanisms that work if you reach for them in time. Don't wait. Don't hope the problem will sort itself out. Get advice. Get documentation. And don't let embarrassment make the decision for you. Rosalie walked out of that courtroom quietly. Her lawyer had his hand on her elbow in the way that lawyers do when they're steering a client away from further damage. I didn't watch her go. There was nothing left to watch for. Neil and I shook hands in the car park. We didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. We'd both done what needed doing. And now, it was done. I drove back over the hill toward home. The harbor gray and wide on the left. The city spread out below me. And I thought, this is still my life. Still intact. Still mine. That felt like enough.